The aftermath of these offer sheets are actually insane. Nick and I are going to talk about it here on Locked On Blues.
You're Locked On Blues, your daily podcast on the St. Louis Blues. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special crossover edition of Locked On Oilers and Locked On Blues. I am Nick Zararis. That is Haley Simon. We want to thank everybody who makes Locked On Oilers and Locked On Blues their first listens of the day. Locked On Oilers and Locked On Blues, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, where through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. So the offer sheet aftermath, the fallout, we're dealing with it. We're grappling with it. There is a lot to unpack. We're going to bounce around the Oilers perspective, the Blues perspective, how we got here and everything. So the dust has settled. How are we feeling, Haley?
I mean, personally, I am feeling so good about this and what went down. I know for you in Edmonton, it's maybe not the same that I'm feeling, and can't imagine.
What have you learned about the Blues in the last week and a half based on this?
I've learned that they're smart. Doug Armstrong, Blues' GM, he spoke to the media yesterday and he explained why he even did the offer sheet. And I think for anybody to even propose an offer sheet it's a risky move, and it's going to have a lot of people talking around the NHL. So I learned that this team, it's so focused on that young core and developing younger players. And yes, while the Blues, the past decade were really focused on winning the Stanley Cup, they got what they needed. They accomplished that. Now it's kind of time to bring in the younger guys and start the developing process all over again.
It's really ironic because the Oilers probably put themselves in this position like 2 or 3 years ago with the short-term decision-making of 2 or 3 years ago. It's playing guys like Kyler Yamamoto and Jesse Puljujarvi. It's signing Zach Kassian so you don't have a runway to give Dylan Holloway an opportunity to play. It's playing Tyson Barrie and trading for Duncan Keith as opposed to giving Phillip Broberg an avenue to play. And there's just such a unique and interesting relationship between experience for a player and playing time. It is very hard as a young player in this league to get bona fide NHL experience before you're 22, 23 years old, unless you're that Connor Bedard type player who's immediately going to make an impact as a teenager. Because I think that's really the big lesson, the big takeaway I have from this is when you look at it from a Blues perspective, they need to get younger. They have opportunity for these guys. Whereas the Oilers, they're trying to win the Stanley Cup right now. This upcoming season is going to be their last best chance at it for a little while. And they don't necessarily have the opportunity to give Dylan Holloway top 6 minutes or Phillip Broberg top 4 minutes. And because of that, those guys probably felt to some degree, well, I have to look out for me. Eventually I'm going to have to go to free agency and say, I am worth this amount of money because of this. And it's hard to do that when you're playing on a third line and you're playing on a third defensive pair.
On the other hand, and I just want to say this, while money is a big thing, and, I'm not an NHL player, I'm not making that kind of money. So for me, I look at money and contracts in a completely different way that maybe some of these players do. Playing on the Edmonton Oilers and being alongside with some of the best in the league is something that I don't feel like money can even equal up to. But again, you make a solid point because I believe that it was Phillip Broberg. He was offered 1.1 million from the Edmonton Oilers. And, he didn't like that. Meanwhile, he's making a lot more with the St. Louis Blues. So besides the money aspect, and obviously they're going to have more opportunity to play in St. Louis, I also look at it as, if I got the opportunity to play, and I'm talking as these players, right? If I got the opportunity to play alongside like a Dylan Holloway, you never know. I mean, the top 6 right now, by the way, in Edmonton is insane. I don't know if any of the guys on the bottom 6 could break that. But, playing with Connor McDavid, Draisaitl, and, I feel like it's just such an opportunity. So again, while I'm from a St. Louis perspective and I can look at this and say they made the right decision, I could also see them they didn't have to sign, by the way, and they could have stuck it out with Edmonton, but there is also rumors going around that they were, and by they, I mean one player was maybe a little unhappy.
Yeah. Broberg definitely is somebody. It's a little different for the European guys who stay over there. They already feel like they've done a decent amount of their development by the time they're 19 or 20, because most of them have been playing against men since they were 16 or 17 years old. A guy like Broberg is in the highest league in Sweden as a 17-year-old, whereas over here you're playing in the CHL, the Q, the W, or college, which isn't really comparable to a professional men's league in Europe. So I can understand from his perspective where he looks at it. Why did I only play 12 regular season games last year when you guys were icing player X or player Y? When you're playing Cody Ceci, you're playing Brett Kulak. Wouldn't you rather have the opportunity of, I know I'm unproven, but I have the potential to be better than those guys? And I can understand it. There's rumors out there floating around that he had requested a trade during the course of the season and that he was looking for an opportunity to play. And for a lot of guys, that's really the key, because in the NHL, the way the contract structure is set up, if you don't have that resume of X number of games played, this much ice time, these counting stats, it's really hard to get any type of money in free agency. A guy like Broberg quadrupling his money year over year. So at the very least, next time around, he's up for a contract 2 years from now, he's going to say, that contract's got to start with at least a 4, if not a 5, a 6, a 7, etc. That's the thing here, where guys don't get opportunities like this. And from, not to get too nerdy, but from a labor perspective, this is a good thing. Everybody gets an opportunity to make more money when stuff like this happens. This, if anything, should encourage more people to take offer sheets.
Absolutely. And I agree to your point. I mean, offer sheets, if they're done the right way, can be really successful. The whole point of an offer sheet and why a team should even do it is knowing that the other team can't match it. And I think the Blues were very strategic in not offering just only Phillip Broberg one, but Dylan Holloway as well, because that really did tie up the Oilers with their cap situation. And I know Kane is rumored to be going to surgery at some point soon. So when he comes back, hypothetically, theoretically, if they were to, match Broberg and Holloway, that would have been a whole other issue that the Oilers would have to then deal with. So I think that it is really interesting. And again, offer sheets are very rare in the NHL, but I think that this might kind of inspire teams to say, you know what, this worked for the St. Louis Blues and let's go try it out. But again, who knows how often we're going to see a double offer sheet to two different players on the same team.
Third successful offer sheet in 16 years. The last one before this one was Dustin Penner, and that was 2008. Yep. That's a very long time ago. And there are really quality players sitting there in restricted free agent right now. Seth Jarvis is a restricted free agent. Jeremy Swayman. There are really good players sitting there, and their teams are kind of trying to figure other things out. And there are plenty of teams that are kind of in that class where the Blues are. You think about the Canadians taking a swing on Patrick Laine. That type of idea where we're kind of trying to be competitive, but we're not really Stanley Cup caliber. That's the type of team. Same thing with Washington trading Darcy Kemper for Pierre-Luc Dubois. What's the harm? If you're bad anyway, at least you're bad. You tried. Whereas if you don't try and you're bad, there's no point.
Yeah. Well, it worked out for St. Louis, and I am excited to see if other teams in the NHL begin utilizing this tool. I doubt it will be anytime this season, but maybe next offseason we'll see another offer sheet being thrown around.
Yeah, if someone offer sheets Evan Bouchard, there might be problems for the Oilers next summer.
The Oilers, honestly, I feel so bad about the whole situation. This is coming from a non-biased point. I mean, obviously, I know Oil Nation is feeling it, losing the cup. You have two prospects that you really banked on, and then an offer sheet happens, which is very rare. I mean, it just sucks. And I can feel sympathetic for another organization. Even though I'm happy with my own organization, I can feel sympathetic. I am human. I can feel emotions for other teams.
That's part of that's part of sports, is that human element. We are going to take a quick break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about the Blues perspective, where they go from here, who they're in competition with their division, and a whole lot more. So be sure to stick around. We are all driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search. Match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for screening, scheduling, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers agree Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites, according to a recent Indeed survey. The thing I like about Indeed the best is it leverages over 140 million qualifications and preferences every day, which means Indeed's matching engine is constantly learning from your preferences. So the more you use Indeed, the better it gets. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions do apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. We want to thank everybody who's making Locked On Oilers and Locked On Blues their first listen of the day. For your second listen, enjoy the Locked On NHL podcast. Locked On NHL provides you with a national perspective on all things NHL each and every day, with national experts and local insights on every team in the league. Available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Shameless plug, Hunter Hodes and I will be ranking the top 10 goalies of the NHL on tomorrow's show. So, Haley, let's get to the Blues perspective.
Hunter, by the way, thank you to the Penguins I just want to throw that in there for giving back, our draft pick. Thank you.
It's very dumb that you can't give other people's draft picks in the offer sheet, but whatever. I'm not here to relitigate the collective bargaining agreement.
Yeah, Hunter's awesome. It's a good show. So,
thank you. When we talk about the Blues, they've been in a weird spot where they have enough talent. Robert Thomas, Jordan Kyrou, outstanding players. Pavel Buchnevich really kind of, I don't want to say broke out because he was already good as a Ranger, but really kind of solidified himself as an upper echelon player. Jordan Binnington had a really nice bounce back season this past year where he kind of solidified himself as not a long-term starter, but he's no longer in danger of being replaced. So when we talk about where the Blues are going, who would you say are kind of in their class, tier, etc. in the Western Conference?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the St. Louis Blues, obviously, they're a younger team now. And just a little fun fact for all of you little stat nerds, the Blues now, with the addition of having Broberg and Holloway, they now have 12 players, 25 or younger, that they have as first round draft picks, which is super cool. So definitely a younger, core group of guys. So whenever I think about, who the Blues' biggest competition is, especially, in the West, I'm going to be a little bit biased and focus on my Central Division. I'm going to have to go with the Dallas Stars. The Stars are a young team. I mean, they do have a lot of veteran talent, but they do have a lot of good younger talent. So again, they're the team to kind of beat. I feel like the Central Division, it's very fluky. I didn't expect Nashville last year to be as good as they were. And obviously, they're kind of scaring me now. It could go either way, though. But I think with the St. Louis Blues, I would see the Dallas Stars as competition. Obviously, you can't count out the Colorado Avalanche. And, I don't really focus too much on the Pacific Division, except for the fact that there's one team, and that is the Kings, that I feel like the Blues are kind of not similar to, but just kind of similar in style to, if that makes sense, with how they play. So that is a team that I would look at and say, you know what, this kind of reminds me of the St. Louis Blues, but in the Pacific Division.
So in getting younger, and I wrote it down, I actually did something earlier today. The Blues have the 13th oldest roster in the NHL. So they're relatively close to the middle. They added 2 new younger guys. Mm-hmm. And the big thing for the Blues now is this is a transformational opportunity for the guys on that team, for your coach who's coming into his first full season as an NHL head coach, to really kind of I'm trying to think of how I want to say this, but really kind of set up the foundation for what the next version of the Blues looks like. They come off the Stanley Cup, they try and maintain competitiveness, they lose out on Pietrangelo, they bring in Torrey Krug, they tried to stay competitive after winning the Stanley Cup. They make the playoffs a couple times, and now they're kind of on the come down from that. But the flip side, the positive spin of that is you've got all these young pieces now. You can kind of project, you can put hope. That's the kind of the dirty little secret of the sports world is if you just load your team up with young guys, your fans will die for them because they're entirely blank slates.
Absolutely. And a player that I really liked last season was Zach Balduke. He actually scored his first goal on his 21st birthday, and I was able to interview him right after that. He is a young player, and Doug Armstrong even spoke out and said, I want him to try to be a top 6 player. I think he can do it. There is a lot of trust within the younger players. We saw Jake Neighbors, and I know everyone's saying, oh, well, Jake Neighbors is going to be an RFA next season. I know. Okay, please don't go after him because we need him here in St. Louis. But you have a guy like Jake Neighbors, obviously Robert Thomas, who is the future of this team and who they're building around. You could even look at DeBoer Dvorsky, who was, our draft pick from last year, one of our first round draft picks, who I like a lot. And I think he has a really good possibility of making the team. Obviously, Adam Yurchek from this year's draft. So we have a lot of guys here in St. Louis that have such potential that are really young players. And again, even if you look at our defense, you have Matthew Kessel, who's a younger player that really impressed me. Tyler Tucker, a little bit older, but still young. And of course, Scott Perunovich. So you cannot count out the young core here in St. Louis. But I feel like that is the direction that they need to focus on, is developing these players. And luckily with the T-Birds, I'm actually a huge AHL fan. So I was a T-Birds fan, like diehard for life. So I got to watch a lot of these players develop who ended up making, the roster last season. We saw Tucker bounce back and forth, and same as Perunovich. But going back on track, I think that if the Blues just continue to develop these younger players, we're going to see a lot of success on the ice.
And if nothing else, it shows good process. Not all of these young guys for any team are all going to work out, but the more of them you give opportunities to, the better chance you have that one of them, two of them, three of them stick and become full-time NHLers, which is kind of your goal if you're a team like the Blues, the Blue Jackets, the Canadiens, the Senators, the Sabres. If you're in that tier where you have a few really good young pieces, you got to complement them. You got to fill out the rest of that team. The Blues are top heavy. They're not a bad roster, but the drop off from that second line to that third line, it's real. And that's kind of what separates, the really good teams from the average teams and the mediocre teams. The one last question I have for you before we wrap up the segment, how realistic is a playoff berth this upcoming season? And then what would it mean to get back to the playoffs with this group of guys in particular?
That's a really good question. And that's an answer that I don't know. Is it possible? Absolutely. Any given team can make the playoffs. Now, again, with the talent that they acquired this offseason, especially now adding Broberg and Holloway, the obvious answer is, oh yeah, they can make the playoffs. But again, we haven't seen enough from them and we don't know how it's going to all, match together. So it's definitely possible. The Blues were the best worst team last season, which means that if they won a couple more games, and yes, I am talking about you, San Jose, that was brutal. But if the Blues won a couple more games, then they would have been in the playoffs. But what it would mean to this city and what it would mean to this fan base, it would be awesome. Obviously last season the Blues, they fired Craig Berube, and we had Drew Bannister, who was the head coach of the T-Birds, come in, and this will be his first season being the head coach for the entirety of the season. So there's a lot on that. Obviously, we have Captain Braden Shen going for his second season as captaincy. So the Blues have more consistency heading into this season. And for St. Louis, it sucks not making the playoffs. Okay, we've had 2 consecutive seasons of missing out on the playoffs. So I think that if a third consecutive playoff miss were to happen, it would just be so damaging and brutal to just the fan base, the players. It's tough. So I have to think that this team is going to really strive to make it to the playoffs.
All right. And that'll do it for our focus on the Blues. When we come back, Kaylee's going to put me under the microscope. We're going to talk all about the Oilers right after this. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Now, we have something a little different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then, with the YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon at a market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment you can cancel anytime if you are as excited as I am for the return of football. Week 1, start of the season. Defending Super Bowl champions in Arrowhead, the Chiefs, Baltimore Ravens, Lamar Jackson, the defending MVP, going against former MVP Patrick Mahomes, the Chiefs 3-point favorites. The night after, that's right, we got Friday night football. The Packers against the Eagles in Brazil. The Packers are getting 2.5 points on the road at a neutral site. Me, though, the game I'm most excited for week 1, The Houston Texans going to the Indianapolis Colts. I want to see if CJ Stroud can follow up one of the best rookie quarterback seasons of all time. The Texans are 1.5-point favorites on the road at Indianapolis, facing off against the returning Anthony Richardson. I, for one, can't wait for the return of football. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook.
Okay, so Nick, when it comes to the Edmonton Oilers, obviously a lot happened besides, the offer sheets. There was some trades that did happen over this past weekend. And I kind of want to get your thoughts on that, especially when it comes to Ceci, right? For me, I didn't think he had the best season, but Cody Ceci obviously was traded. And then you got back Ty Emberson, who actually is projected to be a very good player, good on the power play. So talk me through that. Do you think that this was a good move to kind of maybe not replace Broberg necessarily, but just to have that body?
If nothing else, the fact they got a body back for Cody Ceci matters, because coming into the season, the defense was the question mark of the team. And that bottom pair in particular, they've got, 4 guys who are going to be all auditioning for that spot to play with Brett Kulak. And frankly, they're basically going to be auditioning 4 guys for 2 spots. Someone is going to have to play with Darnell Nurse this upcoming season. It might be Emberson. It might be Troy Stetcher. It might be somebody with no NHL experience who's kind of in the pipeline. Emberson is interesting. He's a little bit old to be this late in his development cycle, I should say. He's 24 years old. He only has 30 NHL games, and he was with organizations, frankly, where you would think a guy would get opportunities. The Sharks weren't exactly lighting the world on fire last year. You would have thought giving a guy who had decent AHL results an opportunity would make sense. The thing that's interesting about Emberson is he played under Knobloch in the AHL in Hartford when they were both in the Ranger organization. So there's some familiarity there. I think that matters to some degree. The thing that worries me at large about the Oilers defense, and Emberson is part of this, Stetcher is part of this, and for all of Cody Ceci's warts, for all of the complaints, for all of the mind-bogglingly stupid plays, he's 10 years of experience in the NHL, and coaches really value experience, especially on that back end. So I do have question marks about how Knobloch's going to run the defense with Emberson, who has all of 30 games. Stetcher's been a 6th, 7th defenseman. He's been around for a while, but he hasn't really been a consistent starter for like 4 years now. So that's a question. And then, if you're going to go into the season with one of those guys definitely in a spot and one of your prospects you feel reasonably good about, how are you going to run your bench when you have basically 3 defensemen you trust?
Absolutely. So kind of going back onto the offer sheet, situation that happened. Obviously, you have, 2 guys that were first round draft picks now, gone. Does this concern you at all with what Edmonton's doing in the front office, or do you still trust that this team is making the right decisions? Obviously, they didn't lose all that extra money matching the Blues. So do you still have trust, or are you like, hold up for a second? What are we doing getting rid of some valuable players? I know they haven't yet to be proven necessarily, but they did have a really good playoff run.
So I think that's a 2-part question, because a lot of this blame goes to Ken Holland, who's no longer with the team, where I do think if Ken Holland were still the general manager, if they had found a way to work that out where he would have stayed on, I do think he would have been able to put a lot of blame on him, because he was reportedly told back during the season, hey, extend these guys now before we have to worry about it. And then something someone pointed out yesterday, Broberg had 79 games played at the NHL level going into the last week of the regular season. And to be eligible to be offer sheeted, you need to play 80 games. If the Oilers don't play Broberg in 2 meaningless games at the end of the regular season, he would not have been offer sheet eligible. He plays in a game against the Coyotes that the Oilers lose like 7-3 because nobody's playing, and a game against the Avalanche they lose like 6-2 that nobody's playing in. Broberg plays in 2 meaningless games, becomes offer sheet eligible. That just goes to show you how little planning Ken Holland put into this. And look, I think the fact that Jeff Jackson was the one who made the free agency decisions on July 1st, and then 3 weeks go by and they bring in Stan Bowman to be the general manager, I think that's part of the problem. I don't think there was a real coherent, this is what we're doing, this, and this. I mean, it's August 21st and we still don't have a Draisaitl extension. Bouchard doesn't have a contract for next year. He's under contract for this upcoming season, but he's an RFA next summer, so he's eligible for a contract. They still need to figure out what they're doing with the Vander Kane and LTIR. It just feels like there are a lot of moving parts. And instead of being like proactive, the Oilers were using their debit card like a gift card where, yeah, sure, Jeff Skinner. Yeah, sure, Victor Arvidsson. And then they went to go buy dinner the next day and, oh, we can't afford Broberg and Holloway. And that's kind of how it feels.
So with Stan Bowman, obviously from a St. Louis perspective, I have my thoughts on him. Now, from an Edmonton perspective, obviously this offer sheet was, huge in a sense that you did lose, as I mentioned, those players. What will it take for you guys in Edmonton to kind of get back, your trust within him? Or did you have any to begin with? You kind of touched on that, but I am curious now your thoughts on him. Do you think he's capable, or do you think that, hey, this was a mistake having him in the front office like this?
Stan Bowman's been born on third base 3 separate times in his life. He was born to the greatest hockey coach of all time. He was given a dynasty with 3 of the 10 best players of his era in Chicago, and he was given the Oilers with 2 of the 10 best players of the era a third time. And you go back and look at the moves in Chicago, whether it's trading for Seth Jones, it's giving away Phillip, it's giving away when you go back and look through all of the transactions, it's giving away Teuvo Teravainen, and that's who I was thinking of. That wouldn't come to mind. The management in Chicago deteriorated very rapidly because he was doing whatever he could to keep the Blackhawks a contender to win the Stanley Cup, in spite of the fact that the core was starting to get older. They weren't really doing anything to complement them. So I was skeptical at the outset that you were going to turn the keys over to a guy who basically had the team ready-made for him the first time around. And this is a good team. I have never been I don't trust Stan Bowman's talent evaluation, especially when it comes to defense. I mean, the only home run trade he had as the Blackhawks general manager was when he somehow got a first-round pick for 36-year-old Duncan Keith from Ken Holland, which I didn't have a lot of trust to begin with. The big thing will be Draisaitl. However that extension turns out, I think will set the temperature for a lot of people, where if it's 13.5, 14 million, which Draisaitl is very much worth in this environment, I think people will be okay with that. But if it's only 3 or 4 years because Draisaitl wants to try and get to free agency one more time before he's out of his prime, I do think a lot of people are going to start to worry.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that Doug Armstrong mentioned is that he did speak to Stan, and Stan said, I need a little bit more than, the second round and third round draft pick. So that's when Doug threw in defenseman Paul Fisher, who's one of our prospects now, one of your prospects, and a future consideration. So do you feel like that was good enough for negotiation, or you're like, what, that is still not good enough? Personally, I still felt like, and if I was looking from an Edmonton standpoint, getting, Fisher is still not good enough because he is not projected to be, a top defenseman, maybe a third pair type of guy, but nothing more than that.
So it's complicated because everybody overvalues their own guys. I'm guilty of this. I think every hockey fan is a little bit guilty of overvaluing their own guys. In a vacuum, you probably weren't getting a first-round pick for Phillip Broberg or Dylan Holloway in a trade. If you just wanted to trade one of those guys in season, you probably weren't getting a first-round pick for either of them. You probably could have gotten a second for Broberg, a second for Holloway, if you were just trying to trade them for whatever reason in season. The problem is the Oilers were banking on those guys being potential upside pieces. And the Oilers now, going into this upcoming season, their youngest player is probably going to be Vasily Podkolzin, assuming he makes the team. If he doesn't, the youngest player on their roster youngest forward on their roster is going to be Connor McDavid, who's 27 years old, which that's a little concerning that you don't have room for upside. And the thing you want when you're trying to win a championship is as much upside as possible. And it's hard to have upside for guys who are 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32. The potential for Dylan Holloway to jump from 9 to 20 goals is a lot more realistic than saying Connor Brown going from 4 to 20 goals or Corey Perry going from 9 to 20 goals. It's a lot more realistic that a 23-year-old with a little more ice time is going to have a big increase in production as opposed to somebody who's 35 years old. And that's really the deal. The Oilers got older. I think ultimately how Skinner and Arvidsson perform is really going to be how these offer sheets are remembered historically. I don't think we'll have a definitive answer on that until probably 2 or 3 years from now, especially if neither Broberg or Holloway really pans out. That's the other thing here. The Blues are taking a gamble on this, It's just they have better means to making this gamble work for them than, say, the Oilers would have if they had matched the deals.
Yep. So my final question for you, and this is something that you actually did put out on your Twitter. You put out a graphic that said, hey, the Oilers are the oldest team in the National Hockey League. And you kind of touched on this, do you feel like this is their last season to chase the cup, or do you think they have a couple more seasons left potentially, or is it all or nothing this season?
So it's a complicated question, so it requires a complicated answer.
And that's okay.
Yeah. The big thing is the Oilers, this is their last really cost-controlled season because you got McDavid at 12.5, Draisaitl at 8.5, and Bouchard at 3.5. Next year, McDavid's going up probably to, Draisaitl's going to go up to like 13.5, 14 million. 2 years from now, McDavid's probably going up to 15 or 16 million. And Bouchard, depending on how they do on the bridge, he's going to be at least 5.5, 6 million. You're talking about $35 million for three guys. And you still have Evander Kane under contract, Nugent Hopkins under contract, Hyman, Ekholm. You're going to need to give Stuart Skinner a new contract by then. Really quickly, you're looking at a Maple Leafs-like situation where you're going to have $45, $50 million in 5 or 6 guys. And we have seen over the course of the last 5 years, you can't build a roster that can legitimately contend for a Stanley Cup with that much money invested in so few guys. So I think the Oilers will be a consistent playoff team in that next iteration, but I think they're going to have to naturally take a step back. I mean, look at where the Avalanche are right now, where they won their Stanley Cup, they started paying McKinnon, they started paying Rantanen, they started paying Makar. They had to hollow out the bottom half of their roster. You know, Casey Middlestat as a 2 is fine. It's not going to be good enough when you're in the second round, third round of the playoffs, and that's really the conundrum here. This is probably it for at least 2 or 3 years for the Oilers. 2-3 years from now, the salary cap's like $110 million, and the Oilers can cycle through the bottom half of their roster, get rid of Kane, and some of the contracts don't look as bad. Maybe, but this is really the last year of cost certainty, which probably means it's the last year of serious contender status.
I really like that answer. And I think one thing to point out too is that the cap will hopefully be increasing. So for all of you hockey fans, that means better opportunities. And, I want to touch on one thing before we conclude this episode. Today, sure, the Blues won, right? But again, we don't know how this is going to pan out here in St. Louis. It could go awesome or it could go bad. And time will only tell. So while people might look at this and say, the Blues, this is awesome. It is awesome today, but it could be a year from now and we could be having a conversation in our 1 year, anniversary recap of this. And I could be like, dude, what actually was this? This was awful. So it's just a perspective way to look at things. And I think that that's important to point out that it's relative, right? So we'll see how they play.
That's what makes it fun. That's why everybody likes being an armchair general manager, because everyone thinks they know better than everyone else. That's what makes this fun. That's why people argue in anonymous hockey forums at 2 a.m. about which prospect is better than the other ones. No one knows. That's what makes this type of stuff fun. There's no way to know until it happens. You can make an educated guess, use as much information as you have, but we're all in the same level of darkness here. Maybe Broberg's a first pair defenseman. Maybe he's out of the league 4 years from now. There's no way to know until it. First round picks keep getting chances. Broberg will hang around. Holloway, guys who are picked in the first round, you hang around forever. Druin, Galchenyuk. If you're a first round pick, they'll keep giving you chances, no matter how actually good or bad you are.
Make sure to comment down below if you think this will pan out for the St. Louis Blues between these two players with Broberg and Holloway, or do you think it's going to be a bust? Let me know down below.
I think the final thing I want to say before we get out of here, I think ultimately we'll judge this based on how the Oilers season goes, not so much how Broberg and Holloway individually perform, because I think no matter what, like the Blues ceiling is probably first round of the playoffs, and then you're playing either Dallas, Edmonton, or
it's low
Colorado in the first round, and you're probably a sharp underdog against one of those teams. It would be a nice season, just to get in, have a little bit of fun. I don't want to say like the Capitals last year, because I think you're better than the Capitals were last year, but that kind of vibe where everybody's happy. We're just happy to be in the playoffs. Maybe we steal a game or two, make them sweat. I think that's probably the highest possible outcome for the Blues this upcoming season. Whereas the Oilers, it's cup or bust, basically.
Yeah.
But that will just about do it for this crossover edition of Locked On Oilers and Locked On Blues. I want to thank everybody who made some time to listen to the show today. If you could be so kind, hit the subscribe button. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave the show's 5-star reviews. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell, get a notification whenever new content goes live, and leave us a comment, whether you're watching on the Oilers or the Blues feed. Who do you think this offer sheet situation is going to work out for better in the future? And thank you for making our shows the first listen today. Go check out the Locked On NHL podcast, where the season never ends and provides national expertise with a local perspective. You can find the link to Locked On NHL in the description, so you don't need to search. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.